Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a real heavyweight matchup with Steven Spielberg's Jaws versus Steve Miner's Lake Placid. And, let's just dive right into it. Jaws is one of the greatest movies of all time. It's one of the most, perfect movies you'll ever fucking see. It's definitely, it might be Steven Spielberg's best movie. I don't know. We'll see how that goes further down the road, but and honestly, what's crazy about Jaws is what makes it so great. One, it's the film score. Like, nothing can top that score by John Williams. Without that score, it's kind of like John Carpenter's Halloween. Is it really that scary, or is just the music that fucking intense? And also at the same time too, that one of the greatest artistic choices in a movie comes about just because they couldn't make the shark look real enough. And so the only way to make this kind of movie scary is by not showing the shark. And you don't really see it until the end of the fucking movie when they, it's like full blown Moby Dick mode at that point. And, even then it looks a little more realistic than you would expect it to look. But if you kept seeing it through the whole movie, you would not be as frightened of that fucking shark as you would be just hearing John Williams score as you watch motherfuckers just get chomped on and stuff. And the cast is great too. Roy Scheider's great as Chief Brody, and Richard Dreyfuss, he's the kind of dweeby motherfucker that just fits perfectly into this role. And then of course nothing tops Robert Shaw as Quint, the guy that helps him get the shark and shit. That dude's got two great monologues in the film. One most specifically is that USS Indianapolis model. It's one of the most chilling performances, deliveries you ever fucking seen in a film, and that's one of the greatest camaraderie sequences in a film too, that leads up to that monologue. So this is clearly a film where Steven Spielberg had found his voice as a filmmaker and knew what kind of films he wanted to make and how he needed to make them. Less is more type thing. And he may have gotten a little overindulgent in the 80s, but this is the best Steven Spielberg would ever fucking be as far as a filmmaker and shit, making the kind of B movie, monster movies that he grew up watching as a kid, and then turning it into an A picture, because, this film launched the whole fucking summer blockbuster shit, the kind of movie that motherfuckers go see multiple fucking times, and it's still never never fails to fucking shock and and terrify you. And then also very funny too. All the townspeople are very naturalistic, and Murray Hamilton is perfect as the fucking asshole mayor. And what's crazy about it, there is a depth to this movie that you don't even have to worry about the depth because it's such a good movie. But the more you watch it, the more you realize it's low-key a dig on capitalism, and the fucking political structure at the time, because this movie come out in the mid-70s, so you're dealing with Nixon, Watergate fucking bullshit, and here we got the chief, who's the equivalent of a sheriff in a fucking western, but it's not a gunslinger that's fucking shit up, it's a shark. But he's powerless to do it because they don't want to shut it down because they need the summer money and all this shit, and so it just kind of deals with all that shit, but it does it so in an entertaining way. It doesn't really tell you who's right or wrong. It kind of leaves it up to the audience to decide, but also takes you on a fun ride, a man versus nature, so to speak, so, and this movie also launched a fuck ton of rip-off and copycats, but none were ever better than Lake Placid. And that people always don't really put those two together, but Lake Placid is the definitive Jaws ripoff, because one, it kind of has no illusions as to what it is. Where Jaws may take itself more seriously because it's more thriller than comedy. Lake Placid is probably more comedy than thriller, but just a cast is just as perfect too, because Bridget Fonda's great, Bill Pullman is the fish and game guy, and then Brendan Gleeson, who looks like Nick Nolte with a thyroid problem, he's exceptional. Oliver Platt, and then of course Betty White, who just delivers all the zingers, steals the show every time she's on the screen. And so, but there's also even from that opening, there's so many blatant Jaws ripoffs, but it also stays its own fucking thing because they do wild shit that like Jaws probably would have never dreamed of. You know, they got a cow hanging from a helicopter, you know, and there's so much snarky dialogue. You know, the script written by David E. Kelly is a little more quippy than like Peter Benchley and Carl Gottlieb's script for Jaws, you know, and of course the USS Indianapolis monologue that Robert Shaw delivers was written by John Milius. And so, you know, that guy, you know, ghost wrote some of the great monologues of 70s cinema. And so, like, Lake Placid, you know, is probably, if we're going by laughs per minute, it definitely beats Jaws, because the thing about it is it's definitely more comedy than thriller, because, and also it begs me to wonder, is it meant to be funny, or is it just funny because the way they play these characters, this is kind of how like these real life people are, you know, the way they interact with each other. You know, you got the uptight city girl dealing with, you know, the country boys and shit, you know, and all that weird, you know, fucking complaint, you know, the culture clash, so to speak. You know, that's how that shit goes down usually in those settings and shit. And so, but it's always funny, you know, motherfuckers are funny in real life. The humor is in the fucking common man and shit, you know, because you got to make life funny when it's miserable type shit, you know. But it's a real fun movie though. Like, it's the fuck, but also the thing too is like even the animatronic fucking crocodile, which is created by Stan Winston, who of course is responsible for shit like Predator. You know, there are times where you can tell when it's digital, but then there are other times where like you can, oh well, this is like, you can tell that's the fucking mechanical shit and stuff. But with Jaws, like, there's no question about it. So at the end of the day, like, for as great as Lake Placid is, it is far from a perfect movie because the ending is total bullshit. You know, like the fucking, they leave it wide open for a sequel, and they did make a bevy of sequels. So did Jaws, but Steven Spielberg made the definitive Jaws movie. You know, they blew up the fucking shark because it's like they capture the crocodile in Lake Placid, and another one pops up, and they blow that one up. You know, but then there's babies and shit. You know, spoiler alert, like I said, watch these fucking movies before you watch the videos and shit. That should be a given. But the thing of it is, like, you know, where something just wraps it up so perfectly, you know, and it's just, can't deny it. It's got to go to Jaws. So for anybody keeping score, that's 15-12. 70s are up by 3. You know, when you got fucking classics like that, you know, the 90s just can't fucking compare. But Lake Placid came pretty fucking close. You know, this was one where I had to do a lot of soul searching and shit. You know, because like I've probably watched both of these movies about the same amount of time, and then watching them again, you know, you have a lot of fun with them, but like nothing can fucking beat Jaws, you know. And my personal opinion, I don't think Steven Spielberg has come even close to topping how great Jaws is. Sure, he made like great movies, but nothing compares to fucking Jaws, you know. But Steve Miner's no slouch either. You know, honestly, if I'm being an asshole, I'd say they're probably about the same. The only thing that, like, you know, differentiates Spielberg from Miner is the fact Spielberg's just got more prestige. You know, he's got a couple of Oscars and shit. But, you know, if anybody's in any doubt that Spielberg doesn't know how to make a fucking movie, just watch Jaws, and it's like a masterclass in how to make, you know, not only an entertaining movie, but a movie that has something to say. So it's like you may not catch the message or like the deeper points in the movie or the fucking intricacies, you know, and the subtleties of how these people interact, you know, because, you know, Spielberg at the heart of his films, for all the popcorn flick bullshit, it's really a, you know, human emotion stories and shit. So, and you definitely get that with Jaws. Whereas like Lake Placid's, you know, kind of that fucking, you know, sexy romp of a fucking adventure film that they would put, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that either. It all makes good popcorn flicks, but, you know, this is a fucking academic journey to figure out who did it the best. In Jaws, nobody's topped it, although Lake Placid came close. So 15-12, 70s are smoking the 90s again. They came close, you know, but, you know, there's going to be bonus rounds. But the next main event is going to be Westworld versus Jurassic Park. So stay tuned for that shit. So we'll see if Spielberg did indeed do anything better than Jaws, or, you know, did it never get better? So, heating up, like I said, if I said anything wrong, eviscerate me in the comments. I don't give a fuck. You got any suggestions? I'm open to recommendations. I got like pages and pages of these things. That's why you'll see more bonus rounds, because I can't wait like 10 years to get this shit done. And I know YouTube starved for content. You know, we'll all have fun together.